I'm seeing now that a lot of people who are playing Final Fantasy VII are Rebirth on their brand new PlayStation 5s, the sort of people who want to play this game on cutting edge hardware. I'm seeing a lot of people come out and acknowledge the fact that, like, yeah, this game does not look or play as good as The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. Now, there's a lot of people coping about that. There's a lot of people seething about that. There's a lot of people in denial about that fact. But the reality is that it is true. It's interesting to think like back on how this played out, right? How so many people like disparaged Tears of the Kingdom and tried to write it off, bringing up like Twitch numbers and sales, so many people tried desperately to downplay Tears of the Kingdom when it first came out, right? You still see people like saying that like, oh, it didn't win Game of the Year, when in reality it totally did, in the sense where it was like the most popular, influential title that released that year, right? It was an absolute banger, right? It was a phenomenon. It was legit like an amazing experience to play Tears of the Kingdom. And a lot of people were in denial about that, continue to be in denial about that. But I think what's really going to like kind of establish Tears of the Kingdom as like a GOAT title, a greatest of all time title, it is going to be the fact, much like Breath of the Wild, that all of the other games that come out after it are not going to be as good, right? Just like how Cyberpunk 2077 and Neo and Elden Ring couldn't compete with Breath of the Wild. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth cannot compete with Tears of the Kingdom. Tears of the Kingdom is bigger. It has more content. It's more expansive. It has more interesting mechanics. What does Rebirth have? The dolphin mini game? Like, come on. It's unbelievably. It is unbelievably poorly thought out how bad Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has been. And like I'm seeing a lot of people cope about that, like, oh, uh, this game is more popular than Final Fantasy 16. That's only because of nostalgia, right? It has nothing to do with the quality of the Rebirth games. Like Final Fantasy 7 is doing well because it's Final Fantasy 7, and the people who grew up with Final Fantasy 7 are just worshiping Final Fantasy Rebirth. Like, oh man, I get to see Eris and Tifa wearing bikinis. Oh, I've never seen a girl in a bikini before because I played on PlayStation and not N64. The average N64 player owner had like girls in bikinis over to play Mario Party and Mario Kart all the time, but the PlayStation owners sat alone in their basements, like, pretending that Eris loved them, right? Like Eris totally loved Cloud, aka me in another universe. Like that was that was like the average PlayStation owner, right? Uh, and those people are adults now in their 40s and still lusting after Tifa, still lusting after Eris, still worshiping Final Fantasy VII, even though the rest of the industry has moved on, right? After Ocarina of Time, we got Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, Skyward Sword, Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom. Some of the best games ever made. What has Final Fantasy got? 8, one of the worst games in the series. 9, something that people don't appreciate because it looks like a Miyazaki film. 10, like one of the most linear games, like RPGs of the period. 11, online. Like, no, like there was a very notable, real decline in Final Fantasy games, but nobody wanted to admit it, right? And right now, we're in this position where Final Fantasy VII is so venerated and so worshipped by the kind of people who don't play RPGs, they can't look back and realize that, like, oh, wow, like the games stop being good after 7, right? They don't have the self-awareness for that, right? All they can do is just say like, oh, 7's the best because it's the only one I like, with no regard as to like what made 7 special, right? Like no regard at all for like the quality of the game or like its competition or anything. Um, in a lot of ways, like the developers, the fans, like the casual players, like they have not moved on from this mindset that Final Fantasy VII is the best ever, right? It's pathetic, it's sad, right? It's abominable, and I do think it's this mindset that is going to result in the end of Final Fantasy because they cannot accept the fact that Zelda is better, right? They cannot accept the fact that Zelda has managed to like evolve and grow and become better than Final Fantasy ever was, right? We're still in that weird like awkward period where people want to pretend that like Zelda is a declining franchise. It never was, but like there was this very real push to like try to pretend that like, oh yeah, Dark Cloud is better, Okami is better, Devil May Cry is better, Oblivion, Skyrim, like Dark Souls, like all of that's better than Zelda, right? Even now, you kind of see a bunch of YouTubers try to push Elden Ring as one of the best games of the generation, completely forgetting that like Breath of the Wild mogs it, and it came out like in 2017, right? There's this like there is this very real refusal to acknowledge Zelda as like the best fantasy series out there, right? Everybody will just like roll over, bend over backwards to try to prop up whatever like mid-tier B string, just boring like niche product out there to try and downplay Zelda. But like the reality is, we are seeing people negatively compare these big AAA games with Tears of the Kingdom, right? And Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a really good example of that because much like Breath of the Wild, it was a sequel. Much like Tears of the Kingdom, it was a sequel to a previous game in the series, right? You know, Final. It's the Rebirth is the sequel to Final Fantasy VII Remake. It was supposed to grow and evolve the formula, grow and evolve the mechanics, like give us exciting new like things to do, like places to explore, stuff like that. It was supposed to be a big deal, but when you actually look at Rebirth, when you actually look at like what the game does, you realize that like there hasn't been any evolution at all, right? When you compare Final Fantasy VII Rebirth to Tears of the Kingdom, like you'll find that Tears of the Kingdom added way more content. It added far more mechanics. It added more things to do. It added like crazy things that nobody has ever seen before in a game ever. Meanwhile, both Remake and Rebirth are just lesser versions of a game we played like 25 years ago, right? The reality is that Final Fantasy VII was never able to compete with Zelda. And the claims that it could, that it was like somehow better than Ocarina of Time, that it was somehow better than Majora's, that it was like one of the best games ever made, like those claims have slowly eroded over the years to the point where like I don't think anybody genuinely believes that Final Fantasy VII is like a masterpiece, right? Like most people who play the game come away disappointed, right? If you're not aware of like what RPGs were like back then, you don't understand its innovations, you don't understand the artistry behind it, you don't understand like the how innovative it was for the time, right? Like Final Fantasy VII is a product of its time in a lot of ways. And Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, right? This new wave of Final Fantasy VII games, like it is not going to be able to keep itself relevant by simply doing the same thing over and over and over again. Square Enix is going to have to evolve and understand that players want something new, interesting, fresh, and exciting. They want the kind of things that Nintendo is delivering all the time. Every entry with The Legend of Zelda, right? Square Enix has done nothing but drop the ball for the past 20 years, and it is about time that fans start to understand that.